what you actually came here for, I'm going to hand this off to Seth Copeland, my husband.
Do this. All right. There's gonna be a lot of this happening probably today. Because we're all diverse in height. That's a good thing. Hi, folks. Welcome to United We Read. This one wraps up the fall, and we pick it up February 3rd, I think. We've got some cool people lined up for the future. But let's get right into it because it's very cold outside. So, and we all need our libations later, right? It's Wisconsin. I actually didn't finalize the order of this, so this is going to be exciting for everyone. So, we have first up our first reader, the 2019-2020 J.C. and Ruth Hall's Poetry Fellow, earned her MFA from Eastern Washington University. A trans feminine poet and essayist, their writing has appeared in or is forthcoming from Black Warrior Review, Crazy Horse, Muzzle, New England Review, Ninth Letter, Third Coast, hey, that's where we are, and elsewhere on the Third Coast. Her chapbook, The Wishbone Dress from Bull City Press, was the winner of the 2019 Frost Place competition, which is very cool. Currently, she lives in this city, teaching and pursuing her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Fancy that. Cassandra J. Bruner, everyone.
Let's see if I can get this. Is that good? Can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Perfect. This is just so in my face. Anyway, so even though I'm a poet, I'm going to be reading a number of flash essays tonight. I just figured that'd be a fun way of shaking things up. So this first one is about the particular joys of being a trans schizophrenic. It's great. The Slenderest Ramifications, Volume 2. Section 4.3.3, Principle 10 of the 1990 Hibictus Standards of Care wrote into practice a double bind for trans people with psychological disabilities. In order to receive care for schizophrenia, bipolar, and/or psychotic episodes, trans patients have delayed their gender-affirming therapies, sometimes over the span of years. The official language reads, the patient having a psychiatric diagnosis, i.e. schizophrenia, in addition to a diagnosis of transsexualism, should first be treated by procedures commonly accepted as appropriate for such non-transsexual psychiatric diagnoses. Earlier iterations were even more restrictive, sometimes outright banning mentally ill trans people from access to HRT, electrolysis, and surgical procedures, as if transness were a delusion, a transitory compulsion that, if acted upon, could damage the patient for life. As someone teetering on the edge of a diagnosis of schizoaffective bipolar, I return to these past parameters with hesitance, as well as gratitude that standards have changed. Instead of treating each condition piece by piece, psychiatric disorders and gender dysphoria receive treatment simultaneously in modern day. Still, I consider the ramifications of this framework, how it postulates transness as another subordinate mental disorder, a genetic fault line in neurons, how, though my sense of gender dissonance predated its onset, my ongoing state of psychosis would deny the legitimacy of my non-binary womanhood for over 2 years, how I've experienced dysphoric hallucinations that would confirm the transsexual doctor's worst hypotheses. Under this regimented light, what wouldn't be reduced to impossibility, to paralytic states of dependency? Whether in reaction to these outdated rules or to the strident activism of the trans community, the current structures around mental disabilities in trans healthcare are merely an inversion of what came before. Now, HRT not only serves as a palliative for dysphoria's resurgent aches, it also promises to mend, to a certain degree, the various psychological conditions which once barred access to the medicinal regimen. Gender-affirming care as alleviator of crisis instead of fulfillment of supposed sexual deviance. Early in my transition, I clung tight to this conception, its bundle of chemical promises, even as I started ceasing taking my mood stabilizers. I remember the day I started ingesting estradiol. Once I got home from the clinic, I palmed the bottle in my hand for minutes, examining the contents as I rotated their container slowly. I could have sworn then I could see the shape of my life and how the pale blue pills tumbled, a monochromatic kaleidoscope depicting immaculate scenes that had already passed me by. What this new model fails to account for, like my abandonment of Lamictal, is that some trans people live with such intense psychiatric disabilities the HRT's potential effects on mood are minimal, if not downright negligible. Not to mention how, for trans feminine bodies acclimated to estrogen, hormones can intensify emotions to the point of exacerbating pre-existing mental health conditions, a blindsiding reality I hadn't prepared for. Stories of cure post-transition afterlives haunted my own as I wandered manic and sleepless through Paradise's runways. And possibly under the strictures of this kinder paradigm, I imagined myself a failed experiment as a voice chipped away at my auditory cortex. Your transness is irresolvable delusion. What could I do but internalize blame for defacing the renovations? This anxiety gathered more substance when hospital staff intimated that my transition was a self-soothing lie, proof that the old standards in the right context still apply. But even the new ones contain the same paternalistic streak, as their insistence on alleviation of pain as a benchmark of success allows them to reserve for themselves, with a dictator's benevolence, the right to withhold care from those who want it. A trans woman who arrives at the threshold of her gender's realization with persisting doubts and depression is not only thankless, but also at risk of delegitimization from the very system that promises her relief. What this fails to recognize is the ever-active presence of the phantom transphobia, which permeates the mesh of trans people's lives. HRT may ease the private pain dysphoria, but it cannot gag every slur, blind each glare, or immobilize the daily threats of violence that constitute trans existence. Barring substantive change to this pervading atmosphere, estrogen can only offer brief remediation, occasional respite. Once, supined on the summer-baked sidewalk outside my childhood church, I saw the outline of the body I was denied superimposed over the body in practice. The bleeding woman outside Jairus' home, witnessing her 12-year wounds close, if only momentarily. Call it hallucination, flash of insight, or natural endpoint of unresolved desire. A reminder that dysphoria units body, mind, and spirit in a peculiar disharmony. What unravels one strand will loosen the rest of the cord. Episodes like this are once in a lifetime, evidence not of the efficiency of neuroleptics, but of their undoubted efficacy. T-blockers and estradiol function in a similar way, diminishing the most intense rifts of my being, but allowing room for intermittent flares. Suggestion that the body requires more deliberate attention. Perhaps, in time, these recurrences will be welcome visitors, negotiating our shared harms into gentle recognition. Okay, so depending on time, I might have two more, but we're just going to take these one at a time. The Slender Ramifications, Volume 1. In windowless rooms, in hushed dialogues between doctors and patients, in the fluorescent halls of Johns Hopkins and hospitals across the globe, the early diagnostic classifications and supposed pathologies defining trans women and other gender disruptors flourished. While transness, by a number of names and identities from culture to culture, pre-existed these conceptions of gender variance, clinics, health insurance agencies, and transnational medical establishments adopted the language of discovery in relation to trans bodies, as if their words conjured us from the other world. Oftentimes, this process boiled down to a what's your fetish roulette, reflective of the widespread presumption that transition sprouted from sexual predilections. To receive access to gender-affirming care, patients would have to ape these models of yearning in order to be legibly trans to their gatekeepers, who have to describe each shadow in a daydream an image too slowly dispelled. A secular confessional with the aim to taxonomize each possible desire. Language, as it will, has evolved as medical institutions have accepted trans people's narratives about their own bodies, minds, spirits, bringing into many of the theories of transsexualism that pervaded in the second half of the 20th century. We see this in a nomenclature alone. Transvestite, a sartorial obsession, to transsexual, gender as conductor of lust, to transgender, an action conducted on a passive body, to trans, a pliable adjective with a wide range of forms. Still, these old myths suffuse the therapeutic and psychiatric spaces where trans patients must sweep themselves into being. In place of the legion of prescribed paraphilias, the modern discourse tempers expectations at the same time it proposes a free dialogue. Is there a woman you hope to look like? A therapist once asked me, adding as an example that she had another patient who pictured herself in Ariana Grande's body. Which is to say, oftentimes I've noticed that there's too high an expectation for what HRT can do. So I want to talk that through with you now. A judgment, accidental, hangs from the rafters of her words. Isn't this practice common for cis minds too? After careful consideration, I say, I don't know, Carrie Brownstein or maybe Kathleen Hanna. What goes unremarked, that this question threads a dozen barbs into my skin. The private shame of having never developed this fiction before, the era of self-importance, wannabe punk feminist icon, traced through my answer, the stain of dysmorphia. Her framework, well-intentioned but reliant on loose cornerstones. Huh, well that's realistic, she quips. Then after a rare pause, are you sure? I can't fault her though. I also carry the antiquated language, a personalized creation myth etched across my throat. A genealogy of the women of those worlds which are my own sacred text. One of the oldest questions demarcating translegitimacy is the inevitable, how long have you known? Since the beginning of my transition, I always claimed to have a prescient knowledge of my womanhood. A glass bead beneath my sternum, ready to burst and diffuse. This narrative, tellingly, matches the arc required to be seen as a true trans woman under the auspices of transsexualism. It's not till years later that I question my certainty. How could I name potential I had no language for as a child? Was a schism lodged in my body, a near invisible lining in the marrow, an ancestral configuration of peripheral nerves? Does it matter if my understanding came later, gestated over months of unfamiliarity with the figure in the mirror? To narrate this doubling history, I offer a new myth. Mount Moriah, and wind rustles through the red cairns as low and quiet as a scorpion. I am Abraham offering Isaac, a child self, on the altar to a vague notion of the divine feminine. It gets dark, and then I feel certain I am going to rise again. When the surrogate ram arrives, so does a swell of disappointment, and after this, delayed contrition. I still have a boyhood to redeem.
Mm-hmm.
Do I have time for one more?
Yes.
Okay. The Slenderest Ramifications, Volume 3. In the video chat, my parents appear robed in harsh, faint blue light. Miami Vice blue, Virgin Mary blue. Blue, not of the robin's egg, but of the cornflowers woven into their nest. Nearly a year into the pandemic and its strictures, none of us knows its pale shroud or its vague approximation of holiness. As if we could never have time enough, my father calls on people from off-screen to list the highlights of the past few weeks. My Mimi's new glasses, my younger brother in the middle of a day-long nap after bartending for his friends, and the youngest reporting how the entire football team at his university, small town, Christian, fell under quarantine due to a teammate knowingly carrying himself into practice with COVID symptoms. Typical, how he regales the stories of others' lives, as if his own were too awkward or intimate, as the self-expression counted as pride, or one of those other sins which flare through the body like sores. My mother bears a similar tick, except it stems from a limestone resolve, a matter-of-fact stance which bills personal matters as minor footnotes in a necessary but unvarnished history. There are affordances, of course. Tales from her shifts at the hospital, either as one of the few dietitians left or as a fill-in for the COVID wards and testing sites, spill out effortlessly. Especially at the dinner table, where my father is known to turn pale and ask her to say the story for a time when it won't spark gastric distress. A tiny rupture forms in my mind. Memories of the hospital 3 months ago, of me unable to parse between hallucination and earth, a hypersaturated film overlaying my eyes. That now feels like slipping, feels like lying though I'm only speaking truth, cistern clean. My father makes a sugar simple joke, and I melt back into the conversation, in the portal linking our houses. Laughter envelops our heads in warmth. Genetic, how we all go in loud and cackling, till our voices run out of notes and become air. Sharp intakes of breath. There's a word, apologetic, I wanted to say, but it molts as we trace this moment instead. We let it fall, sheer, to the unseen floor. Cinder bright and brief flashing, these talks at times swell with a barely detectable yet harsh undercurrent. The fraught history of blood family for trans women. This patchwork chronicle includes the initial rupture with my family after I came out, unceremonious, over social media. Distraught, my parents tested the membrane of my commitment in hopes it would collapse into an acceptance of manhood, enforcing a hard-line rule that I could not start HRT while being dependent on my father's health insurance, as I didn't want to fund my descent. For months, I refused to speak with them, only breaking silence to send them a note explaining I had found a secondary healthcare plan, and begun taking estrogen and T blockers. Attached to this message, a detailed chronology of my exodus from Christianity. Twin-bladed cut, quake with equal aftershock, then another year-long quiet. Turbulence and displacement are such a common refrain in trans people's lives that they form in the mold where home belongs. Historically, even if transphobia shrapnel didn't splinter through families, doctors often suggested that their gender-variant patients relocate in order to ensure the success of their transition. Among other arguments, clinicians suggested that a change in geographic location is almost mandatory so as to avoid any embarrassment to the employer. Likewise, a quasi-accusatory sentiment masquerading as care marks another's assertion that young children are better told that their parents are divorcing and that daddy will be living far away and probably unable to see them. And what havoc did this uprooting cyclone have on patients? Severe isolation, joblessness, suicide, which some theorists of transsexualism labeled as failure. A trans woman's decision to harm herself became a sign of post-transition regret, of the falsehood of her gender. No question, no self-implication of who placed the razor in her hands. In the months of threadbare communication with my mother and father, an echo of this narrative accumulated, a modern after-image of a past impression. While not conducted by my doctor, this schism cut through and rendered every place into not home. A spectral loneliness suspended from my ceiling, overtaking the trees outside. My mind, exiled, would imagine me a standstill before my parents' unmoving front door, an ordinary limbo. I break the wordlessness like an unhealthy fast, inviting them to my city's literary festival, to the dialogues and spaces that constitute my work and practice, the closest position to intimacy I can mine. We brunch, visiting my older sibling in Portland, avoid naming the barrier that divides us. There are pockets of defiance, though. Once, in an upscale pizza bar, I take off my jacket, revealing a lacy floral bralette beneath a semi-sheer tank top. They hide their shock, a sign that they accepted my decision if not my spirit. On the last day, I trashed the veil and ask who all in the family knows. Everyone, they say. And once they leave, I start sending occasional texts to cousins, aunts, uncles, reading their words the way oracles scribe the intestines of cattle. If healthy, prosperity and a long life. If disease, carelessness and a fated end. Now, the strain has slacked, and my parents have adopted an uncertain affirmation of my identity. Proof, perhaps, that the prescriptive solutions to family conflict offered by transsexual doctors lacked imagination, that dislocation is not the inevitable byproduct of transition. Proof of my double-edged privilege. Some days, my mother intimates that she believes my transness predicated by psychosis, the conditions of the soul rewriting biological code. Others, she gives me hand-me-down jeans and blouses. I practice gratitude and gently remind her of Yahweh's declaration that man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. A queer refraction of her theology. That touchboard pendant she holds to her chest. And that's everything.
Thank you, Cass. Oracles breathe intestines of cattle. Ooh. Oh my gosh. All right. I first met, really got to know Cass in Rebecca Jones' poetry class. More from her later. But this individual I've known, I think, as long as I've been up here, and one of the first impressions was that they had an amazing teacherly self, which all of you beleaguered TAs kind of know what that means, probably. This individual was born and raised in rural Minnesota. She writes from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where she is pursuing her PhD as a first-generation student while raising her son as a single mother. Please welcome my friend Beth Vigerin, everyone.
Hi everyone. Apologies for being slightly disheveled. I was just informed a few hours ago that I could read if I wanted to. So here I am, because why not? So yeah, this is my 5th year 5th year here, and my first year is where I also read at Boswell for the very first time. So this feels like I'm coming kind of full circle as I share with you the first 2 pages of my dissertation, which is a counter-narrative to the novel My Antonia, and my book is called Your Antonia. Sorry, it goes right in my face. Okay. Millie Lena, I hope this letter finds you well. I am sorry to hear about your gout and the discomfort it causes you. I have dreamt of seeing you in San Francisco, in your home with all of its fine furnishings, and in your shop filled with beautiful textiles and handsome dresses. It is kind of you to invite me, but who will take care of my boys and Papa? Suzanne is busy with her new baby, so I do not want to bother her with my travel luxuries. Thank you so much for the $50. I put it toward the mortgage. Let's see what next year brings, for I would love to see you and Tiny again one day. As for this book of Jim's, what do I say? It is my story, mine. Mine, Suzanne's, and of course the rest of us like Yulka and my poor daddy. Jim visited last summer, as you know. I thought he wanted to help my Leo get into university like him. But maybe he was here to steal my memories. I would have given them to him if he had asked me. He never wanted to stay in Nebraska, never wanted to be a farmer. I didn't wish those things for him either. He does not love the land the way that I do, the way that I must. When I think of Jim, I miss all the great things that could have been but will never be. Maybe tell me your thoughts, but only if you think I should have them. I don't have time to read books. You know I have always been this way. Vache Antonia. Rego, Blackhawk, Nebraska. I was so hungry. Papa kept promising there would be plenty to eat when we got to our new home. And then I was so tired, I forgot how hungry I was. Papa had me recite the words I learned on the ship to America. We go, Blackhawk, Nebraska. I said them to a man at the train station with big, shiny buttons and a hat with the shapes B and N. He patted my head and took my hand. So I grabbed my sister Yulka's hand, scared he was taking me away from my family. There were 6 of us, my papa and my mama, Ambrose, and me, Marek, and Yulka. He took us to a boxcar at the back of the train. We had no place to sit. The wooden benches were full of people who looked like us, but not like us, with their drooping shoulders and tired faces. We were pushed into the front corner of the car. It was the furthest away from the bathroom, but the whole metal box smelled like a toilet. The smell put me back on the ship and our perilous journey across the ocean. The journey had been hard on all of us, but it had been especially hard on Marek. He didn't understand what was happening on the ship, and our fellow passengers had threatened to throw him overboard. Now, Mama sat on the one suitcase containing all our belongings. Papa said we would buy new things when we got to Blackhawk. I sat on the floor, and Yulka sat in my lap. To pass the time, I helped her practice counting with corn kernels we found in the corner. I couldn't keep the dust out of my eyes, nor could I stop rubbing them, which only made it worse. The air was so thick, it felt funny to breathe. Yulka's face was so dirty, it was almost the shade of her dark brown eyes that had been full of fear ever since we set out on our journey. We were all dirty like Yulka, except Papa, who somehow managed to stay clean, even when Mama swatted at him with her dirty hands. It was her idea to come to America. There was no opportunity for boys in Chechi. America was the land of opportunity. Everyone was going to America. Ambrose would be a big man in America. We had been on the train for a long, long time when a family huddled near our corner shared some of their broth with us. The hot liquid felt so good going down my throat. And we were so cold on the train. We had been cold for a very long time that I felt numb. And I was desperate for food and warmth that I drank greedily. Then my comfort quickly turned to pain. It felt like someone was poking me with a hot stick in my stomach, which prevented me from falling asleep, even though I desperately wanted to. When I made it to the land of slumber, I found myself in my favorite flower field back home. It was filled with yellow and white flowers. I was running through it to fetch Papa home from playing music with his friends. I was almost across the field when I woke up to Mama pulling on my hair. "Get up, we're here," she said. I rubbed my gritty eyes to see clearly. The box held fewer people now than before. Several were preparing to depart the train in Black Hawk like us. Some were Americans returning home, but most were like us, immigrants eager to call America home. We arrived in the dark. I was sure I was still dreaming because the world we stepped out into was a world I couldn't see. The wind whispered through the grass, causing my skin to quiver. Strangers were moving around us, but I could barely make them out, only outlines hunched against the wind. Our friend would meet us, Papa said, but I didn't see how he would find us. Then suddenly, a man just as dirty as the travelers appeared in front of us. He held a lantern so close to my face that the heat warmed my cheeks. I grabbed Papa's arm for safety. The stranger asked us if we were the Shimerdas. It was heartening to hear our language again. We had been the only Bohemians since the ship, and even on the ship, Marek's illness had prevented us from interacting with many people, especially after they all turned against us. But now we had a Bohemian friend to help us make our way in Nebraska. I felt relief. Sadly, it did not last long. Krajiek was a distant relative of Mama. That was all I knew. He was talking fast to Papa. The train had arrived late. He had to stay in town for a long time. He had no money and was very hungry. He smelled sour and swayed a little as he stood. He wanted food for Mama. When she said we didn't have any, he hurried us into the wagon so we could get home to get some food. I only had one idea of what a home was. Our cozy little house thousands of miles away, a place abandoned by its family. I longed for my bed, stuffed with goose down, so snug and warm. I longed for a bed to sleep in, this close to home. But everything was left behind. Everything that contained my childhood. I was climbing into the back of a wagon with my family when I saw a boy staring at me. He looked at me like he knew me, but I had never seen him before. Then a tall man with a long shadow on his face came up to him, and they loaded into a wagon near us. Theirs had a tall, covered top, and even though it was so dark out, I could see that it was much bigger than ours. We had no belongings, but could barely fit into the wagon Krajiek had arrived in. The canvas covering had tears on the sides, letting in the endless wind. We all huddled together to keep warm for the final part of our journey. Krajiek's lantern offered a prick of light for guidance in the front. Out the back of the wagon was darkness. The mules seemed just as tired as me, but their feet were steady and they knew the way and were in no hurry to get there. The road was rough. Yulka and I were in our usual traveling positions, her tiny frame in my lap and my arms holding her close. I whispered bits of encouragement until I bit my tongue and then my cheeks from the dips and bumps in the road. I quickly learned to set my jaw and took to staring out into the night. I tried to imagine my new life here in America, but I couldn't. I could only see my home that was no longer my home. The night air was muggy and smelled like a root cellar. I looked for the stars and could only make out a sliver of the moon moving across the sky until it was gone from my view. We went over hill after little hill until it felt like we would never stop, like we were traveling across the ocean again. It wasn't until this moment that I knew I would never go back home. I held my little sister, Yulka, tight against me and sang to her, Holly dici, hole, buche, ashni, ushnesh, odi, juke, as Papa taught me. I was trying to relax my arms, to soften the ride for her, trying not to bite my tongue again, trying to picture my new life, trying to forget my old friends, the ones I knew I'd never see again. Thank you.
you, Beth, so much. So I met Cass in class, and I met Beth in orientation, but this next individual I met in a very special place, a place where students, members of the community can really commune and come together and be as one and break bread. And that place has been taken from us, and it's called Guest House, and it's in the basement of the student union. So anyway, this next individual is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, Turtle Clan, and descendant of the Red Cliff and Bad River bands of Ojibwe, Bear Clan. She writes, I'm so sorry, I zoomed in too far. She writes fiction and poetry while pursuing a PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We met right before the pandemic, and I'm so glad that I've got to know this person a lot better since then. Sass Demi, everybody.
Just a second. So thank you so much for inviting me and Boswell for hosting. This is going to be the first time I've read my fiction. I think I've only ever read my poetry up till now, so a little bit nervous, but okay. So this story is called Mythologies and Fruiting Bodies. Sarahut Sarah, listen. Aksa will teach you a song to repair, to reconnect, to clear out rot and bad thoughts. But this song has a secret. Do you want to know the secret? Shh. Sarahut Sarah. I knew from the moment we stepped on the trail that we were being watched, observed, measured, not only by eyes and ears, paws and snouts. No, this felt different. An itchy, organic smelling something that suffused the air and made my forehead itch, my eyes water. Brad didn't seem to notice how tense and quiet I was, but you wouldn't have found me surprised by that at the time. I was almost entirely under his control by then. He had no need to keep a careful eye on what his Indian girlfriend might be noticing. The tattoo on my stomach had become infected and I was still sore. I tried to ask him where our campsite was because I had the map, but he'd shushed me. The woods are for quiet contemplation and reflection. Didn't I know that? Shh. What kind of Indian was I anyway? The first time Brad tattooed me, I was asleep. A tiny black moth etched into the skin on the inside of my elbow. I didn't even see it until I'd left his house and showered. I called him a little angry, but mostly scared. How did he manage it without waking me? He had laughed that laugh of his, the light and airy one that made me feel like I was the gravity holding him down and ruining everything. And he told me I'd agreed. Didn't I remember? I didn't remember agreeing to anything, but that laugh always shifted my perception, took me outside of myself and made what I was thinking or feeling seem ridiculous or histrionic. I'm magic, sweet girl, he'd said, when I insisted on knowing how he'd done it without any pain. I thought about singing. The second time Brad tattooed me, I was awake. He didn't raise his voice or his hand. Instead, he ribbed and cajoled me until I understood that to refuse was to prove how inadequate and ill-fitting I was for him, how disappointed he would be. The tattoo hurt this time, and although I didn't ask for his magic or cry at the lines of fire he drew over and over, that didn't make me feel proud or brave. Slowly, over time, my arms were devoured by the black ink he told me he ordered special for me. Then, it swallowed my torso. I stopped being able to wear a bathing suit because everyone had their opinions. My mom and sister eventually stopped talking to me because I refused to break up with him over the tattoos. I didn't like them, but Brad always found a reasonable explanation or justification for their appearances, and they knew how bad my memory was. I probably did forget. I stopped being able to look at myself in the mirror. If I became too angry or resistant, he might kiss me on the neck and give heartfelt apologies until my pulse quickened and I thought of other things. He might roll his eyes and laugh that laugh. He might slap me, slamming my lip into my front teeth, causing a gash I would have to hide by avoiding my family for a month. I'd asked him once if he'd ever tattooed other people. He gave me this funny look, as if it had never occurred to him that I could wonder such a thing. He touched me on the nose with his knuckle, patted me on the head, and called me silly. Of course, he'd never done it with anyone else. When I asked questions like that, it made him wonder about the strength of our relationship and how much I love him. I didn't want that, did I? I knew in that first sacred moment on the trail, where I had wanted to go camping for his birthday, that I was not alone with him anymore. I smiled, but had to stop because he asked me what the hell was so amusing. At first, the only outward signs of the present were small noises. We heard whenever we rested on the initial hike into our campsite. Rocks click-clacking in the distance as if shifted by pursuing feet, the susurrus of colliding leaves, rushing waters, and winds merging so seamlessly that they began to sound more like whispering voices. Brad began to twitch now at most of the sounds, asking me, "Did you hear that?" "No, Brad. I can't hear what you tell me not to hear." I sang the secret. I thought of my OXO as we unpacked our tent and supplies. The springs and summers, she'd take all of us grandkids out berry picking in the woods behind her house on the res. She would alternate between cooing what good workers we all were and screaming at us to listen. Each time, before setting us loose on the poor foliage, she'd sternly tell us, "Don't none of yous go listening to no voices in these woods, you hear me? Are you listening to Grandma? You don't respond or call back to any voices. Ignore any whistling and stay where I can see you. You want the goat man to get you? Then you listen. You don't move towards the whistles, the whispers, the deepness that could open chasms beneath you." But I'd already fallen into a chasm. I needed another to escape it. Oxo had warned Brad the morning before we left, waving her gnarled and swollen knuckled hands in front of her as she told him what she tells her grandchildren. He laughed that fucking laugh and said, "Sure, Granny." "We're Haudenosaunee," I'd said in the car later, on the verge of tears without having the words to tell him why. "She was raised traditional, and she raised me after my parents died. Please don't laugh at her like that. At us." "Us," he'd smirked. "I thought us was you and me," he'd said. And he knew all about our myths, remember? I'd met him in our American Indian Studies class. I had laughed when I shared some of the stories I had grown up with. Why could I laugh, but he couldn't? He tattooed a tree on my thigh that night, but it was missing the roots, and no matter how much I argued, he couldn't see how unnatural it was for a stump to just stick out of the ground on a leg. The morning after we arrived at the campsite, Brad wouldn't speak to me. At first, I assumed it was because he was angry about our argument in the car. He could rearrange time, slicing a moment that caused him anger, saving it like a cold slab of leftover chicken to reheat later when he was hungry for a fight. "You have a reckless mouth," he'd said. "Yes," I'd agreed. It wasn't until after I'd finished making us breakfast that I finally noticed he had yet to look at me, or even in my general direction. I brought the breakfast dishes down to him at the river to wash, and he refused to turn around. I'd been irritated for a brief second when he simply stayed hunched over the rushing waters, holding his hand out behind his back, like he was a long-suffering daddy waiting for his daughter to place her hand in his. But irritation was reserved for him. I never felt what he told me not to feel. I told him I was going for a little stroll into the surrounding area to look for mushrooms or berries, but I really just went and sat underneath a tree 50 yards out of camp. I scratched the area around the tree tattoo on my leg. I watched Brad walk back and forth at the river's edge, pacing for hours, never once looking upward toward the direction of our camp. I got bored and went to fish further upriver, where the fish wouldn't be contaminated by him. I sang the secret over and over and over until my mind grew fuzzy and the words began to change from intelligible to incoherent sound combinations I couldn't grasp. When he returned to camp, he'd strode past me as I roasted the fish I'd caught and went straight to the tent, zipping it shut. 20 minutes passed before he came out and finally faced me. His eyes were shifty as if he couldn't figure out where to let them rest, but he had this grin on his face, and at first I felt a rush of relief because I was foolish enough to think he was out of his black mood. But then he told me to come to him, and I saw his tattoo gun. The whistling started on the third night. It wasn't a specific song, but I swore it sounded like my grandpa, the way he used to whistle on his way to grab a beer out of the fridge. Brad swore he didn't hear it, but flinched every time it started up again. He tried to reach for me, no doubt to put his gun to me again, but I shook my head no and kicked at him every time he did. He eventually huffed like an angry toddler and went to bed. I kept trying to talk to him, asked him what his problem was, but he told me if I didn't shut up and let him get some peace, he would cut my tongue out. Not the first time he threatened it. Okay, Brad, I said, I'll hold my tongue. Oxote's secret sings itself. I stayed out near the fire almost all night, kept hearing vegetation and soil shifting as if something were slowly roiling its way through the underbrush surrounding the tent. It was nearly morning when I finally slipped back into sleep. When I laid my head down next to Brad's, his back was to me. I could see tiny pale hairs protruding from a few of his pores on the back of his neck. Before I drifted off, I registered a slimy sounding trickling noise coming from the direction of his face. I went to sleep smiling. The next night, someone or something was moving around outside of the tent. Brad lay next to me, his back a massive wall protecting my right side and blocking the exit. The hairs on the back of his neck were growing longer. I lightly brushed my fingertip against one of the filaments, and it moved in a way that suggested perception and expression. I held my hand against my chest, my heart drumming louder and louder. I debated waking Brad up. I sang instead. I heard a wet thud just outside the zipped up tent flap. Then the whistling started again. It all sounded like it was coming from right in front of the tent, almost daring someone to unzip, take a peek, just a glance. I stayed awake all night, my back to Brad, listening to his breathing go from deep and steady to wheezing and shallow, listening to the shh of things moving, crawling, spreading. Brad was gone when I woke. I stayed still, hoping to hear some sign of where he was outside so I could avoid him as much as possible. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind running its fingers through the trees and the pitter-patter of raindrops pelting rainproof nylon. Eventually, I crawled out of the tent, but nearly took the whole thing down when I reared back to avoid stepping on Brad's prone form at the mouth of the tent. He was face down, his head nearest to me as if he tried to crawl back in. My stomach roiled as I realized his skull would have at least been cracked if I hadn't stopped myself from stepping on it in time. His arms and legs were twisted in odd directions, rips and tears on his pants and shirt, his jacket missing entirely. I didn't look too long at the red and white colored substances that appeared to be oozing from some of the tears and angles of breakage in his arms and legs. Fine white hair grew over his entire body, pushing up through his clothes. I didn't think he was still alive, but I also didn't want to touch him to be sure. I sat on a tree stump on the perimeter of the clearing we camped in. I pressed my fingertips against the skins of various roots that ruptured from the ground around it, some like delicate capillaries reaching for the sky, and others as thick as my wrist burrowing back down into the dark soil. I couldn't decide if I was sad, relieved, or scared. What did I feel if he wasn't there to tell me? The forest was cacophonous with births and deaths, the rhythms of a back and forth, a give and take too ancient for me or any of us two-leggeds to ever comprehend. I didn't have to sing anymore. I don't know how long I sat there with Brad's body, but the sky was already beginning to bruise and darken when I heard rustling, movement. I looked up towards Brad. His back rose and fell. My heart staccatoed as I rushed to stand, prepared to run. His ass lifted slowly, as if something was underneath him, pushing upward from the ground. A hissing sound pierced through the noise of the forest, along with a steady whoosh, whoosh. It took me a horrified second to realize that Brad was slowly standing up. There was a change in the rhythm of the whooshing sound, and then Brad was on his knees, crouching. I didn't know if I could face him one last time, or meet his eyes again. I started to walk around him, hoping to sneak away without him noticing. I sensed more than saw that he was still moving. The sounds of his efforts were stuttered and staggering, as if he was struggling to find his feet. There was a grating moan from his direction, and I knew I had to look. I didn't have to worry about meeting Brad's eyes. They were rolling around like tilt-a-whirls. His head was tipped straight back, facing the sky, and his mouth was open wider than should have been possible. Fissures and tears started to appear at the corners of his lips, the skin protesting the stretch his jaw was forcing it to do. I couldn't move as I watched the slit start to travel further up his cheeks, and with a resounding crack, his jaw opened even wider. Brad's mouth became a gaping maw, waiting for something to fall in. It was shockingly bloodless, and I had to spend precious moments figuring out why. The white hairs I'd been noticing on his neck now seemed to be growing from all of his wounds. They bloomed and curled up and out of the chasm in his mouth, tangling like a time-lapse video of the mycelium that spreads far and wide beneath the mushroom. I started to cry, but I couldn't tell you why. Then I saw his eyes. They were not blank or closed. They were staring. His eyebrows were spread wide, and when he seemed to register that he was looking at me, they began to fluctuate wildly on his forehead. He seemed to be trying to say something. There was a sucking sound as his teeth and tongue slapped against each other. I did feel something then. A wriggle in my chest and a flash of electricity that seemed to turn the sky a shade of blue I'd never seen before. And all I could think about was the time Brad had tattooed a large fish over my chest. That was the first time I had really fought back. He told me I reminded him of the koi he'd stolen from his neighbor's decorative pond. He hadn't realized how strongly it would fight, he said. It excited him, he said. I'd become still and let him do it. I'd held my tongue and watched the light in his eyes go dull, hardening like petrified wood. It had put a pit of fear in my gut that I had never known before. Back in the clearing, those eyes now turned into a brown sludge that bubbled and began to spill out. I finally moved, backing away. A puff of blood orange powder burst from his mouth. The strangely vibrant plume rose from his gaping skull soundlessly, spores riding the wind, scattering Brad's rot across the forest floor. I didn't have to sing anymore. I ran. Shh, my girls. Remember the secret of your grandmothers. Sara. You don't need a tongue to sing.
Very high tech here, as you can see. Well, since I've been saying how I know everybody here, this next individual was an instructor of mine in the spring of 2021. Has been on committees and such, and most importantly, was in Cream City Review before they were an instructor here. So that's the most important thing. The author of 5 books of poetry. The most recent strike was the 2018 New Issues Poetry and Prose Editor's Choice. And she has appeared in Agni, the Southern Review, Kenyon Review, Field, Alaska Quarterly Review, Antioch Review, and most importantly, Cream City Review. Dr. Rebecca Dunham, everyone.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. It's like very strange to be in front of people and not like giving readings over Zoom. So, and thank you Boswell for hosting us. In the spirit of this, one of the things I love about these readings is that I get to hear what students are working on, and so I try to hold myself to reading some of the stuff I'm working on, which is particularly painful this time. I don't know, but, and I'm gonna read some poems from Strike, which came out less than a year before the pandemic, so I actually haven't even read from it that many times. So, yeah, I think that's all that I need to say by way of introduction. Okay. Parable of the Hat. Ah, sir, a distinct universe walks under your hat and under mine. The man woke one day, inexplicably desirous of a hat. This is no simple fashion statement, the haberdasher warned. The man refused to remove the bowler, first indoors, which was merit and politeness, and the others let it go. Then he began taking baths so as not to wet and deform its brim. This is nothing to mess around with, his wife said. He wore it to bed, flipped the crown right over his face. The smell of his hair unwashed and the bowler's oily funk kept her up at night. That and the fear that the man beside her had no face, was blank-featured as a mannequin. You should try it, he told her one morning. I don't know what's going on inside your head, she said. Oh, he said, you know. Thinking, the circumference of the head is the girth of the soul, and how could he leave that dangling on a hook for anyone to find, to run their fingers round its edge? thinking not even her. Think, he said instead, of the magician with his top hat. She closed her eyes, rabbits from the void. Then, inside the soot chimney of the conjurer's hat, she could see a world of private griefs, could discern a latch, a door half clasped. She extended one hand, groping, and grasped dull brass, pressed. So the last year has been an interesting one. At my home, just because I have a junior high daughter who is like going through puberty, and then I have a teenager, older teenager, 19-year-old, who is going through sort of a second puberty as she's transitioning. And this has led to so many bizarre conversations about like how women present themselves, or how should we act? Why do people say I'm sorry all the time, and all of these kinds of things. And it's actually really weird when you start trying to articulate some of this stuff out loud as if it's like advice. I don't even know. So I'm gonna read a couple poems that I guess to me sort of connect to that idea. The Interlocutor. I know many men, many of whom say they practice kindness to all men. To them, they say, man is just a synonym for human, nothing but a noun one can put in its place. They tell me to put myself at ease, to drift safe in grammar's amniotic embrace. It is nothing to them, the power that a single key can strike. Pinched with concern, their soft brown eyes regard me. No matter how hard they try, they cannot see why I care, why it matters, why it might matter so much. Sorry. They cannot see why I care, why it might matter so much relies on the difference between men and men, shift plus M. Sorry. All right. And this poem takes as an epigraph a quote from Alexandra Petrie, I'm not sure how you say her last name, but she writes satirical material for the Washington Post. And during the pandemic, I was like, as all of us probably was, like reading every newspaper I could. So yes, she was often a breath of fresh air. But The Penitent's Tale. Woman in a meeting is a language of its own, Alexandra Petrie. Like when you're in a foreign country, do you think this is please, maybe a misunderstanding? Like in the taqueria when I said I was embarazada, meaning embarrassed and not pregnant, which I wasn't. No, I'm not, saying I'm not. When you heard me vow to decimate your report, I said disseminate. I will work on enunciation, and I solemnly swear the annual party was held at that new tapas bar and not a nude/topless bar. I can't say how sorry I am you both misheard and neglected to read the invite. I'll not hijack the listserv again. I can see now it's reserved for things like finding a cat sitter. No, I completely understand. It was totally different the time you did that, and exceptions can be made. Exceptions can be made, but not for me, of course, and I would never ask you to compromise. This is all misunderstanding, and I will try to use I statements. And as to the gray circus elephant in the room, it wasn't a threat that day I wore black. I mean, I like green, and pink is okay, too. So I don't cut out of work early to hurry home to my kids. No, I know you're an amazing father, and I am aware it's not the same thing at all, because for you it's a statement about gender rights. And for me, it is only a matter of gender. No, I'm not being sarcastic. Well, maybe. I will watch my tone. Sorry to interrupt. Of course. Go on. I'm sorry. I'm not against men. I married one. No, I love all. No, of course I see nothing wrong with your capacity for understanding. No, the error's mine. You were right. I couldn't survive the sharp slam dunk of a carnival ride, and I'm sorry the brownies I baked upset your stomach. But I don't know, maybe you're intolerant to lactose? Please tell me what you want from me. And no, that's not me being aggressive, only I think there's been some sort of missed potato thing, so when I say elude, you hear elude, and say I'm not well read. No, not anti-read. I am all pro, all the way. I can commit. I will mop up your milk and coffee spills. You are all full plates, and I know you are busy, and I'm not being clear. I'm sorry, I don't understand. So that was when I was going to start this part. All the way through. Okay. I have a few elegies that I'm going to read too. I seem to always have elegies. So let's see. Yeah. So this one it takes place in Circus, Reno, Nevada. And if you've been to Reno, I mean, it's a great area. I mean, the world, you know, there's just like a great natural scene there, but it's like depressing in the way that like it's not even Las Vegas, you know, it's like a let down Las Vegas. So anyway, Circus, Reno, Nevada. Elegy written in neon lights. A single cart trundles the hotel's long hall. Its loose wheel rattles and soothes me like the clatter of the train that once punctured my childhood sleep. Its iron rails less than a block away. No death, no grief, no too thin walls. Only the gravel river of my parents' voices to deny, the flash flood levels rising up the stairs after lights out. Here, the lights never go out, not even when a stick figure body, 5 simple strokes and a circle for a head, dives down night's black page. An ink blot, a migraine aura, blue, green, red, always too much red. It spins and blinks so fast that no one could blame anyone for missing it. And this one is called Elegy Salvaged. And it's first student. I had my very first semester teaching back in 1996. And I was about a month into the semester when I went to start class, and it was a community college, so it was just like, I don't know, somebody who worked part-time kind of came up and had this condolence card for me and told me that one of my students had committed suicide, and asked me to just have everybody in the class sign it. And I was just like, I've been teaching for 4 weeks, I have no idea what to do. But it's just something that's haunted me for years. And as I'll say in here, I've never really managed to have a poem out of Elegy Salvaged, for my student 1978 to 1996. A list of things I didn't know. 1, the survival rate of a child whose parent commits suicide, 3 times that of the rest of us. That writing a freshman composition essay about his father's suicide is what they call a warning sign. 3, that writing his second essay about guns and hunting was probably not a good thing in light of the above. 4, how to tell my class he killed himself. I think sometimes there are really only 3 poems that I need to write. And if I could get them right, I would move on and do something more useful with my life, like serve people coffee and cake, or plant trees, or learn the capital of every single state. I've tried to write this poem more times than I can count. Once I wrote, how your wound radiates out like a star, shot in the head, I still cannot meet your eyes. I can only tell you that the night you died, a train screamed by for hours. Sound and light come to us as delay, as a gap between incident and experience, lacuna inhabited by our dead. The train is invented, though to be fair, in Roanoke, it could easily have been true. After 2 decades of teaching, all I really want to say is this: God save me from another poem with another screaming train. A list of things I didn't do. 1, go to his memorial service. I made it as far as the entry, couldn't bring myself to sign the guest book to pick up the pen. 2, read his final week's writing journal, afraid of what I'd missed. There was no body to view anyway. Sometimes I despise myself for my excuses, for my self-flagellation. What use am I say, if I can't even write this damn poem for him? And then I must despise myself some more for lavishing myself with such extravagant self-pity. What I always wonder about are the moments before. I drove by the motel where he did it once, thinking how it was considerate of him to do it there and not at home. Did he turn on the TV? Did he notice the display of miniature toiletries arranged by his chambermaid? Did he sit on the bed or stand? Poetry fails me. Carolyn Forchet. There is no other way to say this. No, there is not. Anna Akhmatova, can you describe this? No, I cannot. What I do recall, 1, how he sat in the back, baseball cap pulled down low over his brow. 2, he came to every class on time. 3, he had a girlfriend. I don't know how I came to know this, but I do. 4, as an editor at the local paper, I could have asked to edit his obituary, but didn't. Once I wrote, between my bedroom window and its sill, early winter stars. Nothing could blunt the lapidary post, could soften such hard edges. The dead are like that sometimes, their light traveling to us from unspeakable distances, signal unanchored by a source. I liked ampersands then, and stars. The only word worth saving, unspeakable. Okay, and then I have, I think, just 2 more. Okay. So I don't really write happy poems, but these are like towards the end of the book. Yeah, I know, right? But they're towards the end of the book, so like, for what it's worth, you're gonna see like the happy ending that I can, which isn't much, but elegy and obad. If 5 a.m.'s blue hour sweeps your brow, if you dip your head over a mug's ghostly vapors, unable to sleep again, if you long for more, if you feel yourself go under for the 8th time already today, go under the black wave, if you long to depart, if you know you'll never leave and can't even tell twilight from twilight, and there are those who would wish you the very worst, or worse, wish nothing for you at all. If this is both elegy and obad, then let the particular cast of this day's light flow blue as Scylla in spring, and let the heave of your lungs make a song of itself. Let it blanket you. The Fall of Manna. And this is an ekphrastic poem. I wrote it, it was just a painting in Madison. There's the Chazen Museum is associated with the university, but they had a lot of us in the community write poems about works of art that were up. So. The Fall of Manna. I do not need to be told how we are forced to gratitude through famine and pain. 40 years of loss, my woman's lot. I cast my eyes down, clutching this vacancy like a humble pewter bowl holds its emptiness, its doubt. I am a mouthful of tamarisk, of dust, faith's word mare silver lichen. The heart stutters and stops. Death is a shawl we stretch our limbs beneath, sunken ribs, no heart or lungs to swell and contract, nothing to break the quiet. Sand fans the emptied sky. How much I would give for relief, for love restored, for a gift that comes before it is too late. Tooth white, this reign of old age. How much I desire my hair to whiten, not with labor, but with the flowering drift of promise. To hear manna fall not in silence, but in ash song, words woven into hymn, gentling me like a mother's hand skims her daughter's head. To lower my bowl, scoop up hope, and then, greedy, to lift the hem of my dress to cradle and catch whatever else I may have missed. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. I want to thank Bob.
Boswell for being so generous with their time and their space tonight. Thank you guys so much. This concludes our fall sessions. Elsewhere in the community this Sunday, Tabby Poe open mic at County Clare, hosted by our alumnus Amanda Reevy. Mario the Poet, our new Milwaukee Poet Laureate, will be the feature. And as always, folks, for those of you who are afraid to sing about love, about rage, about pain, or about just how damn cold it is outside, don't be, because united we read means united we're listening. Have a wonderful night, folks.